A single act of kindness in a crowded diner taught a billionaire father that true wealth isn't money, it's the love and joy we give to those who need it most. Richard was a man everyone in the city knew. His name was printed in newspapers. His face often appeared on television whenever new business projects were announced, and people admired him for the empire he had built. But behind all the shining glass windows of his companies and the luxury cars in his garage, Richard's life was not as complete as people imagined. For years, he carried a quiet sadness that no amount of money could erase. That sadness was tied to his son, Ethan, a boy who had been born with a disability that made walking impossible and everyday tasks difficult. Ethan was only 8 years old, with a gentle face and wide eyes that always seemed to search for something in the world around him. He had a wheelchair that had become an extension of him, and while Richard made sure it was the best one money could buy, it never changed the fact that Ethan's life was different from other children. Richard's wife, Ethan's mother, had passed away when Ethan was only a toddler. She had been the light of their home, the one who knew how to make Ethan laugh and how to soften Richard's serious personality. When she died, Richard's world had fallen silent. He had all the wealth in the world, but when he went home at night, there was only emptiness waiting for him. Raising Ethan alone was both the greatest challenge and the greatest purpose of his life. Richard wanted to give his son everything: comfort, care, the finest doctors, the most advanced therapies. But still, there were moments when Richard sat in silence and realized he could not buy the one thing Ethan needed most: a normal childhood. The sight of other children running in the park, playing on swings, laughing together, those were simple joys Ethan could never fully join. And that thought broke Richard's heart in a way that business losses or financial risks never could. Despite his busy schedule, Richard created a small tradition. Every Sunday, he and Ethan went to a little diner in town. It was not the kind of place where billionaires usually spent their time. The diner was cozy, with checkered tablecloths, the smell of coffee always hanging in the air, and the sound of plates clinking as families enjoyed their meals. Richard chose it because it felt ordinary, safe, and warm. We wanted Ethan to experience something real. Outside the walls of mansions and private hospitals, each Sunday Richard would roll Ethan's wheelchair through the front door, and the two of them would sit by the window. Ethan loved sitting by the glass, watching people walk by, watching cars slow down at the traffic light across the street. Sometimes he would smile when he saw children chasing each other on the sidewalk, but there was always a hint of longing in his eyes, Richard noticed, and his heart would tighten, but he never said anything. He only reached out and placed his hand on his son's shoulder, a silent reminder that he was not alone. The waiters and waitresses at the diner knew them. By now, they treated Richard with respect. Some of them could not hide the curiosity of seeing such a powerful man eating in their humble place. But Richard never cared about the whispers. He dressed simply on Sundays, no suits or ties, just a father taking his son out for lunch. The only thing that mattered to him was Ethan's smile when the food arrived. Pancakes with extra syrup, milkshakes, sometimes scrambled eggs, was always the same order. But Ethan never got tired of it. Still, despite the small joy, Richard noticed how his son rarely interacted with others. Ethan kept his eyes low when strangers approached. If someone smiled at him, he gave a tiny nod but never spoke. It was as though he had built a little wall around himself, protecting his heart from the outside world. Richard understood why. People often stared at Ethan, sometimes with pity, sometimes with discomfort. Even when they tried to be kind, there was always a difference in the way they looked at him. Ethan felt it. Richard often thought about his late wife during these Sundays, remembered how she used to kneel beside Ethan, lifting him out of his chair with such gentleness, whispering in his ear until he laughed. She had a way of making him feel seen, not as a child in a wheelchair, but simply as her little boy. Richard missed that more than anything because he struggled to give Ethan the same warmth. He loved his son deeply, but his love often came in the form of protection, building walls instead of opening doors. One evening, after returning from the diner, Richard found himself standing by Ethan's bedroom door, watching his son asleep. The soft hum of the medical equipment beside his bed filled the room. Richard thought about all the things he wanted for Ethan, the friends he wished his son could have, the playgrounds he wished Ethan could run across, the mother's love he could never replace. And in that quiet moment, he admitted to himself that he felt powerless. He could control boardrooms, negotiate deals worth millions, and lead thousands of employees. But when it came to his son's happiness, he often felt lost, yet he never let go of hope. He kept the Sunday routine alive, believing that maybe, someday, something unexpected might happen. Maybe the world would show his son a kindness that would break through the silence. He didn't know when or how, but he held on to that thought like a man holding on to the last light in a dark room. Every time he wheeled Ethan into the diner, he hoped it would be the day when his boy smiled a little wider, when someone treated him not as a burden, but as a child full of life. He hoped for a sign that Ethan's world could be bigger than the wheelchair and the walls of their home. What Richard did not know was that one Sunday, very soon, that sign would command it. Would come in the form of an ordinary waitress who saw Ethan not for what he lacked, but for who he truly was. The Sunday that would quietly change everything began like any other. Richard parked his car outside the little diner, stepped out, and carefully helped Ethan out of the vehicle. He unfolded the wheelchair, gently placed his son in it, and together they moved toward the familiar glass door. Ethan's hands rested on his lap, and his eyes scanned the street with that quiet curiosity he always carried. To strangers, it was just another father and son coming for lunch. But to Richard, it was one more attempt to give his boy a normal moment in a life that had rarely felt normal. The diner was buzzing that morning. Families filled the booths. The smell of bacon and coffee hung in the air, and soft chatter mixed with the clinking of cutlery. Richard guided Ethan to their usual table by the window. He noticed the waitstaff moving quickly between tables, carrying trays, pouring coffee, greeting customers. Nothing felt unusual until a new voice reached their ears. "Good morning." "Welcome in," a young woman said, walking over with a notepad in her hand. She was Nur, had never seen her before. She had dark, curly hair pulled into a bun, a cheerful smile, and a warmth in her voice that stood out even in the noisy diner. Her name tag read Maria. She looked at Richard for a moment, polite as most servers were when they recognized him, but then something different happened. Instead of keeping her focus on him, her eyes went straight to Ethan. Maria crouched slightly so she could be at Ethan's level. "Hi there," she said softly, smiling. "I love your wheels. Pretty cool chair you got." Ethan blinked, almost startled. Most people, when they approached the table, spoke to Richard first. Some gave Ethan a quick glance, maybe a smile, but they rarely addressed him directly. This woman, however, looked at him as though he was the most important person at the table. Richard watched silently, unsure of what would happen. For a moment, Ethan didn't respond. His small fingers gripped the edge of his wheelchair, his lips pressed tightly together. Richard felt that familiar ache in his chest, the fear that his son would retreat into his shell again. But then, something surprising happened. A tiny smile flickered across Ethan's face. It was shy, almost uncertain, but it was there. Maria noticed it immediately and laughed gently. "Ah, there it is. I was hoping I'd get a smile today." She winked at him, then straightened up and asked, "Do you want the usual, or are we trying something new today?" Richard, still processing the brief exchange, cleared his throat. "You'll have the pancakes with syrup and a strawberry milkshake." "I'll take the same coffee as always?" "Perfect," Maria said, jotting it down. "But I'll let him know a secret: our pancakes are extra fluffy today." The cook was in a good mood. She gave Ethan another smile before walking away. Richard sat back in his seat, almost unsettled by what had just happened. It wasn't that Maria had done anything extraordinary. She hadn't offered pity or acted overly cheerful. She had simply treated Ethan like a child, like someone who deserved attention and conversation. And that tiny shift seemed to have stirred something in his son. When the food arrived, Maria returned with 2 plates balanced on her arm, and the milkshake carefully placed on a tray, instead of setting the food down quickly and rushing to another. "Table?" She leaned slightly toward Ethan. "Do you want me to put the straw in, or do you want to do it yourself?" She asked. Ethan hesitated, then whispered, "Myself." Maria nodded as though she had just received the most important answer in the world. Got it. Here you go, champ. She placed the drink carefully on the table within Ethan's reach. Richard froze. It had been weeks since he had heard Ethan speak to a stranger. His son's voice was so soft, it could have been lost in the noise of the diner, but Maria had heard it and treated it like a victory. She didn't make a big deal out of it, didn't clap or draw attention. She simply carried on, making Ethan feel that his small choice mattered. Over the next few Sundays, Maria became a regular part of their routine. She was always working when they arrived, always with that same warm smile. Sometimes she joked with Ethan. Sometimes she asked him about his favorite colors or cartoons. Sometimes she just teased him about how much syrup he poured on his pancakes. Each time, Ethan's reactions grew a little stronger. He smiled more, sometimes giggled quietly, and even began to answer her questions with short words. Richard watched this change with a mixture of relief and wonder. For so long he had tried to break through Ethan's silence, to pull him out of the invisible wall he had built around himself. But where Richard struggled, Maria seemed to walk right through that wall without even realizing it. She never treated Ethan as fragile. She never looked at him with pity. She treated him like a boy with thoughts, feelings, and jokes of his own. And Ethan, in return, seemed to bloom in her presence. One Sunday, as Richard wheeled his son into the diner, Ethan's eyes lit up at the sight of Maria carrying plates to another table. He tapped his father's hand, his way of signaling excitement. Richard almost stopped in his tracks. His son, who so rarely expressed eagerness for people outside their family, was smiling because of someone else. When Maria noticed them, she called out across the diner, "My favorite pancake team is here." Ethan giggled, a sound so pure and rare that Richard felt his throat tighten. He hadn't heard his son laugh like that in months. Maria rushed over, crouched beside Ethan, and whispered, "I told the cook to make yours with extra magic today. Don't tell anyone. It's a secret recipe." Ethan covered his mouth with his hands as if holding back more laughter. Richard couldn't help but stare. He had brought his son to therapists, doctors, and teachers, all of whom worked tirelessly to encourage him. But here, in this noisy little diner, an ordinary waitress had managed to do something extraordinary. She had reached Ethan's heart without trying. That day, as Richard watched his son laughing softly at Maria's silly jokes, he realized something he had almost forgotten. Ethan still had the ability to connect, to feel joy, to be seen. And all it took was someone willing to see him not as a boy in a wheelchair, not as the son of a billionaire, but simply as Ethan. Richard sipped his coffee in silence, his eyes never leaving his son's face. The first time in a long time, he felt something warm settle in his chest. Hope. Something was changing. And he couldn't quite explain it, but he knew it mattered. He didn't say anything to Maria, didn't thank her yet. But deep down, he understood that these small moments were the beginning of something bigger. And though he didn't know it then, the bond forming between his son and this waitress was about to lead to a moment so powerful it would bring Richard himself to tears. It was a bright Sunday afternoon, the kind of day when the sunlight seemed to pour through every window and make the little diner glow. Richard wheeled Ethan through the familiar glass door, expecting another quiet lunch like they always had. But he noticed something different about his son that morning. Ethan's eyes looked more alive, his shoulders less tense. There was a small spark of excitement in him, the kind Richard had longed to see. And when Maria noticed them from across the room and waved enthusiastically, Ethan lifted his hand, hesitantly but clearly, to wave back. Richard felt a smile tug at his lips. It was such a small gesture, yet for Ethan it was progress beyond measure. Maria rushed over, her face lighting up as if she had just seen two dear friends. Well, my pancake champions are back," she teased, kneeling to Ethan's level. "You ready for your magic pancakes today?" Ethan giggled softly, a sound that always surprised Richard with its sweetness. Maria winked at him and stood up to take their order, moving with the same energy she always had. But that day would not remain ordinary for long. As they waited for their food, Ethan leaned forward, reaching out toward the napkin holder on the table, His small hand struggled to grip it, and Richard instinctively moved to help. But before he could, Ethan pushed harder. The napkin holder wobbled, nearly toppling, and his wheelchair rolled slightly backward. Richard's heart jumped into his throat. "Ethan," he said sharply, his hands moving to steady both his son and the chair. But Maria was quicker. From across the room, she had seen the little accident unfolding. She hurried over, her movements swift and graceful, and before Richard could fully react, she crouched down, reached out, and gently scooped Ethan into her arms. Richard froze. His son, who almost never let strangers get too close, was suddenly lifted against Maria's chest. But instead of panicking or shrinking back, Ethan let out a burst of laughter, little arms wrapped around Maria's neck, holding on as if he had known her forever. His giggles echoed across the diner, pure and bright, startling Richard into silence. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Maria held Ethan securely, swaying him just slightly as though it was the most natural thing in the world. "Whoa there, buddy," she said warmly. "Got a little adventurous, didn't we?" Ethan buried his face into her shoulder, still laughing. It was the kind of laughter Richard hadn't heard since his wife was alive, the kind of unguarded joy that came from trust and comfort. It hit Richard with a force he hadn't expected. The other customers glanced over, some smiling, some whispering, but Richard didn't notice them. Eyes were fixed on his son, his fragile, shy boy resting in the arms of a woman they barely knew, not with fear, not with discomfort, but with complete happiness. Richard's chest tightened. For years, Ethan had been cautious, holding back from the world, even shrinking away when well-meaning people tried to pat his shoulder or ask him questions. But now, in Maria's embrace, all of those walls seemed to fall away. Richard's throat burned. He wanted to say something, to tell Maria to be careful, to ask Ethan if he was all right. But no words came. His eyes grew wet as he realized he was witnessing something he had thought impossible his son. Choosing closeness, choosing to trust someone outside of their small, guarded world. Maria noticed the emotion on Richard's face. For a brief second, she looked at him, her eyes soft, understanding something deeper without needing it explained. She simply adjusted Ethan in her arms, balancing his weight carefully, and whispered, "You're safe, sweetheart. I've got you." Ethan's laughter slowly calmed into small giggles, his arms still tight around her neck. Richard wiped his eyes quickly, hoping no one saw the tears that had escaped, but he couldn't stop them, watching. His son in that moment was like seeing a door open that had always been locked. He had spent years trying to give Ethan everything: comfort, safety, the best of everything money could provide. Yet here, in a tiny diner, an ordinary waitress had given Ethan something priceless: the feeling of being held without hesitation, the feeling of belonging. Maria finally lowered Ethan back into his wheelchair with the utmost care. "There we go," she said gently. "My king." Ethan's face glowed with happiness. And Richard noticed something he hadn't seen in a long time. His son looked free, as if the weight of being different had momentarily vanished. Richard leaned forward, touching his son's hand softly. "You okay, buddy?" he asked, his voice hushed. Ethan nodded, his smile wide. "She's funny," he whispered, his eyes still shining with joy. Maria laughed, giving him a playful salute before heading back to grab their food. But Richard sat frozen, his mind replaying what had just happened. His son, his quiet, guarded, fragile boy, had not only allowed someone to hold him, but had embraced it, had laughed, had shone brighter than he had in years. As Maria placed the pancakes in front of them a few minutes later, Richard found himself watching her with new eyes. She moved around the diner with ease, balancing trays, greeting customers, and yet she always had time to glance back at their table, checking if Ethan was still smiling, and he was. He poked at his pancakes with enthusiasm, sipping his milkshake, glancing at Maria every few minutes, as if waiting for her to come back and make another silly joke. Richard's emotions swirled inside him. He felt gratitude, awe, and something else, something heavier. A deep sadness that it had taken this. Longed for his son to be seen, truly seen, by someone other than him. For years, Richard had been carrying Ethan's world on his shoulders. shielding him, protecting him, but maybe in his fear of rejection. He had also kept Ethan from moments like this, moments of connection, of warmth, of laughter with others. That realization made his eyes sting again. He looked at Ethan, who was happily chewing his pancake, and thought of his late wife. She had always told him that their son needed more than just safety. He needed to feel alive, to feel part of the world. Richard had tried, but he had done it cautiously, too afraid of what people might say or do. And yet this young woman, with no hesitation, had given Ethan what he needed in an instant, as the meal went on. Richard found himself quieter than usual. He sipped his coffee slowly, watching the exchange between Maria and Ethan. Every time she came by, Ethan's face lit up a little more. Every time she teased him gently, his laughter rang out again. And Richard, sitting there with tears quietly slipping down his cheeks, knew he was witnessing something rare and precious. It wasn't just kindness. It wasn't just friendliness. It was something deeper, something that had reached into the fragile corners of Ethan's heart and pulled out light. And for Richard, a man who had thought he could control every part of his son's life through money and effort, it was a humbling, breathtaking reminder that sometimes the most important things came from the simplest, most unexpected places. When they finally left the diner that afternoon, Richard wheeled Ethan toward the car, the sound of his son's laughter still echoing in his ears. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his face glowing with a joy that had been missing for so long. Richard tightened his grip on the handles of the wheelchair, his chest heavy with emotion. He had never imagined that a single moment, a single embrace, could change so much. But it had, and as he buckled his son into the car, his own tears still fresh, Richard realized he would never forget the sight of Ethan in Maria's arms, laughing like the world had just become a brighter place. It was a memory carved deep into his heart, one that would stay with him forever. Richard sat at the small table in the diner, but he hardly tasted the coffee in front of him. His hands rested on the edge of the table, his eyes fixed on his son. Ethan was still glowing with happiness, still smiling as Maria passed by carrying plates for another family. Every time she walked near, Ethan's eyes followed her, and every time she looked back at him with a playful wink. He giggled like the sound of bells in spring. Richard had not seen his son so alive, so free, in years. The sight overwhelmed him, and his chest felt heavy as though his heart could not contain all the emotion at once. He had always believed he was protecting Ethan. He had built walls of safety around him, giving him the best care, shielding him from cruel stares, making sure no one ever treated him with less respect than he deserved. But in that moment, watching Maria's simple kindness, Richard realized he had also been holding Ethan back. He had kept him too close, too hidden, afraid of the world's coldness. And because of that, Ethan had been missing something more important than comfort. He had been missing human connection. As these thoughts struck him, Richard felt tears prick his eyes. He quickly wiped them away with the back of his hand, embarrassed at the thought of anyone seeing him like this. He was Richard Hale, a man who was supposed to be strong, composed, in control of everything. People in the city looked at him as a man with power, a man who could bend circumstances with wealth. But here he was, undone by the laughter of a little boy in the arms of a diner waitress. Maria returned to their table, placing a napkin in front of Ethan and refilling Richard's coffee. She crouched down beside Ethan again, speaking softly so only he could hear. Richard couldn't catch every word, but he saw the way Ethan leaned toward her, listening carefully, and then smiled with pure delight. Whatever she had said was like a secret shared only between them, and Ethan loved it. His shoulders shook with tiny laughs, and Maria looked at him with a warmth that was not forced, not polite, it was real. That was the moment Richard could not hold back any longer. The tears slipped down his face before he could stop them.
Ow.
His chest tightened, and a sob threatened to escape. He quickly pressed his fist against his mouth, turning slightly toward the window as if to hide it. But the truth was plain. He was crying. Not the quiet tears of frustration he sometimes shed in the privacy of his home, but deep, raw tears that came from a place he had kept locked away for too long. Maria noticed instantly. She touched Ethan's hand gently, then looked up at Richard. Her eyes softened, and she seemed to understand without him saying a word. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't try to comfort him with empty words. She simply stayed there, one hand resting lightly on Ethan's wheelchair, anchoring both father and son in that fragile moment. Richard took a shaky breath, but the tears kept coming. His mind raced with memories, his wife's laughter echoing. In their home, before she passed, the first time he had held Ethan as a baby. The countless nights he had sat awake worrying about his boy's future. He remembered how powerless he had felt when doctors listed all the things Ethan might never do. He remembered standing by playgrounds, watching other children run and climb while Ethan sat quietly in his chair. I'd carried all those emotions, for years always hiding them behind a mask of strength. And now, in the middle of a noisy diner, they were spilling out uncontrollably. Ethan looked up at his father curiously. He had seen his dad cry only once before, when he was very small. "Daddy," he whispered. Richard leaned forward, brushing his son's hair back with trembling fingers. "I'm okay, buddy," he said, though his voice cracked. "I'm just so proud of you." Ethan tilted his head, puzzled. "Wait. Why?" Richard swallowed hard, his tears falling freely now. "Because you're so brave, and because you smiled today. You let someone in. I saw you laugh like I haven't seen in so long. It makes me so happy, Ethan. Happier than anything in the world." Ethan's eyes softened, and for the first time, he reached his little hand across the table and rested it on his father's. The gesture was small, but it carried more comfort than Richard had ever known. His son didn't fully understand why his father was crying, but he understood enough that it was about love, something too big for words. Maria remained quiet, giving them space, but she couldn't stop her own eyes from watering. She had seen families come and go in this diner, but she had never witnessed a moment so raw, so filled with love and vulnerability. She didn't see a billionaire at that table. She saw a father breaking down because his son had just shown him a piece of joy he thought was lost forever. Richard pressed his forehead into his hand, shaking with silent sobs, but he forced himself to lift his eyes again. He wanted to remember this, to carve the image of Ethan's glowing smile into his memory forever. He didn't care that strangers might be watching. He didn't care if anyone recognized him, the powerful man crying over pancakes. All that mattered was the truth of what he was feeling. His son was alive in a new way, and he was witnessing it. After a while, Richard managed to compose himself a little. He wiped his face, took a long breath, and looked at Maria. "Thank you," he whispered. His voice was unsteady, but his eyes were steady with meaning. "You have no idea what this means." Maria smiled softly. "I think I do," she said. Her tone carried no pity, only sincerity. "He just needed someone to see him, that's all." Her words struck Richard like a revelation. That was it. His son had needed to be seen not as a fragile boy in a chair, not as the son of a rich man, but as himself. Maria had done it without hesitation, without effort, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And in doing so, she had given Richard a gift he could never repay. For the rest of the meal, Richard was quieter than usual, but his silence was not heavy, it was full. He kept looking at Ethan, memorizing every detail of his son's joyful expressions, and every now and then, fresh tears rolled down his face. But this time, he didn't wipe them away quickly. He let them fall. They were not tears of despair. They were tears of release, of gratitude, of hope returning to a heart that had been too guarded for too long, when it was finally time to leave. Richard lifted Ethan gently into the car, buckled him in, and stood for a long moment before closing the door. He looked up at the sky, the sunlight warming his face, and let out a shaky laugh through his tears. His heart felt raw, but also lighter than it had in years. He had thought he was strong because of his wealth, his ability to control situations, his power to protect. But real strength, he realized, came from moments like this, from vulnerability, from love, from allowing others in. And in that little diner, on that ordinary Sunday, a waitress with a kind smile had reminded him of the most important truth of all. His son's life could still be filled with connection, joy, and love, if only he allowed it, as he drove home. Ethan humming softly beside him, Richard knew he would never forget the way his tears had fallen that day. They were not a sign of weakness. They were the beginning of something new for him and for his son. From the very next Sunday, Richard noticed a subtle but powerful change in Ethan. The boy's laughter had returned. But it was different now, lighter, freer, almost contagious. Every time they entered the diner, Ethan's face would brighten. Before they even reached their usual table, he looked for Maria immediately, scanning the room until he found her, and the moment their eyes met, a spark of pure joy lit up his small face. For Richard, watching this transformation was like witnessing a flower finally bloom after a long, harsh winter. He had spent years trying to help his son find happiness. But it seemed that all it took was someone willing to simply see Ethan for who he was. Maria continued her gentle, caring ways. She remembered small details about Ethan, like the way he liked extra syrup on his pancakes, how he preferred to stir his milkshake counterclockwise, and how a simple joke could make him giggle for minutes. To most people, these would have seemed like trivial things, but to Ethan, they mattered. To Richard, watching her notice these little things and act on them was a revelation. It taught him that joy often came in small, seemingly ordinary gestures that money could never buy. Richard himself began to open up more, not only to Maria, but to the world beyond their small family. He realized that he had been protecting Ethan so fiercely that he had also limited the experiences his son could have. Now, he encouraged Ethan to interact more, to explore new games, and to talk to other children, even if only briefly. He arranged playdates and outings, gradually introducing his son to a wider circle of friends, while Richard still felt protective. He had learned from Maria that allowing Ethan to experience life fully, even if it meant small risks, was essential for his growth and happiness. The bond between Ethan and Maria grew stronger. Sometimes she would arrive early, or stay late too, spend extra time with him. She read him stories, taught him simple games, and even helped him learn small skills that boosted his confidence. Each time she laughed with him or encouraged him to try something new, Richard's heart swelled with gratitude. Maria had become more than a waitress. She had become a trusted friend and a quiet guide in Ethan's journey toward joy. One afternoon, Richard watched as Maria encouraged Ethan to try reaching for a small toy on a shelf just out of his immediate grasp. He struggled, and for a moment, it seemed like he might give up. But Maria's calm voice, her gentle guidance, and her belief in him inspired Ethan to keep going. He leaned forward, stretched his little arms, and finally touched the toy. A triumphant smile spread across his face, and he laughed with delight. Richard's chest tightened with emotion. He realized that these moment-small victories were shaping Ethan's confidence and independence in ways that no therapy or wealth could replicate. Richard began to understand something profound. Love and care were not measured in money or luxury. True care came from presence, from attention, and from the willingness to see the other person as they truly were. Maria had taught him this without even intending to. Her simple kindness, her patience, and her genuine attention had opened a door in Ethan's life, and unexpectedly in Richard's heart as well. With this new understanding, Richard also changed how he interacted with others, became more patient, more attentive, more willing to step back and let Ethan lead in small ways. He asked questions. Instead of giving instructions, waited for Ethan's choices instead of deciding for him, and celebrated small achievements with genuine pride. These changes created a ripple effect in their household. The home, once filled with careful schedules and strict routines, began to feel warmer, softer, and more alive. As weeks turned into months, Richard observed that Ethan's laughter had become a regular part of their lives, not just a fleeting occurrence. He had more confidence in social situations, he expressed himself more freely, and he even began to initiate interactions with strangers, though cautiously. Richard realized that the world no longer seemed intimidating to Ethan in the same way. He was discovering life piece by piece, someone who truly cared guiding him along. Maria also became an integral part of family life. Richard trusted her completely, and she never overstepped boundaries. She simply offered her kindness and her presence, creating a safe space where Ethan could explore, learn, and grow. On special occasions, she joined them for outings, celebrated small victories, and even helped Richard navigate the emotional challenges of single parenthood. Through her, Richard learned that asking for help and accepting support was not a weakness but a strength. One day, Richard found himself sitting quietly in the diner, watching Ethan and Maria interact. Ethan was laughing as she helped him stack toy blocks into a tower taller than his wheelchair. When the tower toppled over, Ethan shrieked with delight, and Maria clapped her hands, pretending to be shocked. Richard's eyes welled with tears once again, but this time they were tears of pure joy. He realized that the small, everyday moments, the smiles, the laughter, the playful gestures were what truly mattered. Richard also noticed the impact on himself. For the first time in years, he felt lighter, happier, and more connected to his son. The walls of stress and isolation that had built up around him in the years following his wife's death were slowly crumbling. He had learned that he did not have to shield Ethan from the world entirely. Rather, he could guide him, support him, and allow him to experience life with courage and joy. Maria's example had taught him how to be a better father, not by giving more material things, but by giving love, attention, and trust. In the months that followed, Richard made changes to their Sunday routine. He began inviting a few close friends and their children to join them at the diner, giving Ethan a chance to interact more broadly in a safe and familiar environment. Each new interaction was met with curiosity and occasional hesitation, but Maria's steady presence helped Ethan navigate these experiences. His confidence continued to grow, and Richard's pride in his son deepened with each small victory. Through all of this, Richard also reflected on his own life. He realized that despite his wealth and power, the most meaningful experiences had nothing to do with money. The laughter of his son, the kindness of a stranger who became a friend, and the shared moments of connection were far more valuable than any luxury or success he had achieved. He understood that true fulfillment came from relationships, from seeing others thrive, and from opening oneself to the simple joys of life. Eventually, Richard invited Maria to be more formally involved in their lives, not as a servant or an employee, but as a trusted family friend. She accepted with humility, always careful to respect boundaries, but with genuine enthusiasm for spending time with Ethan. Together, they created a routine that blended care, joy, and freedom. Ethan's life expanded in ways Richard had never thought possible, and Richard himself became a more attentive, empathetic, and present father. By the end of that year, Richard reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. Ethan laughed freely, explored new experiences, and had developed a confidence and warmth that had been hidden for years. Richard had learned that love could not be bought, but it could be nurtured, shared, and encouraged in ways that made the world feel safe and bright. The little diner, once just a place for a simple Sunday meal, had become the setting for transformation, not just for Ethan, but for Richard as well. Through Maria's care and his own willingness to change, Richard and Ethan had discovered a new way of living, one filled with trust, joy, and connection. It was a life richer than any material wealth, a life filled with laughter, courage, and the quiet power of kindness. Richard knew that the lessons he had learned from a simple act of human compassion would remain with him forever, shaping the way he loved, the way he parented, and the way he moved through the world. In the end, the billionaire father had discovered the most valuable lesson of all, that true happiness comes not from possessions or power, but from love, human connection, and the courage to open one's heart. And for Ethan, the little boy in the wheelchair, life had become a place of laughter, trust, and endless possibilities, all because someone had seen him, embraced him, treated him with the kindness he deserved.